And about in 2005, let's say in central India, the day after the MOU was signed with the biggest sort of corporation in India, Tatas, the government also announced the formation of the Salva Judum, which is a sort of people's militia, which is armed and is meant to fight the Maoists in the forest. But the thing is, all this, the Salva Judum, as well as the Maoists, they're all indigenous people. And in, let's say, Chhattisgarh, something like the Salva Judum has been a very cruel militia, you know, burning villages, raping women, burning food crops. I was there recently. Something like 640 villages have been burnt. Out of the 350,000, first about 50,000 people moved into roadside police camps from where this militia was raised by the government. And the rest are simply missing. You know, some are living in cities, you know, eking out a living. Others are just hiding in the forest, coming out, trying to sow their crops, and yet getting, you know, those crops burnt down, their villages burnt down. So there is a sort of civil war raging. And now, I remember traveling in Orissa a few years ago when there were not any Maoists, but there were huge sort of mining companies coming in to mine the bauxite. And yet they kept, all the newspapers kept saying the Maoists are here, the Maoists are here, because it was a way of allowing the government to do a kind of military-style repression. Of course, now they are openly saying that they want to call out the paramilitary. And if you look at, for example, if you look at the trajectory of somebody like Chidambaram, who's India's home minister, he, you know, he's a lawyer from Harvard. He was the lawyer for Enron, which pulled off the biggest scam in the history, a corporate scam in the history of India. We are still suffering from that deal. After that, he was on the board of governors of what is today the biggest mining corporation in the world called Vedanta, which is mining in Orissa. The day he became finance minister, he resigned from Vedanta. When he was the finance minister, in an interview, he said that he would like 85% of India to live in cities, which means moving something like 500 million people. That's the kind of vision that he has. And now he's the home minister, calling out the paramilitary, calling out the police, and really forcibly trying to move people out of their lands and homes. And anyone who resists it, whether they're a Maoist or not a Maoist, are being labeled Maoists. People are being picked up, tortured. There are some laws that have been passed which should not exist in any democracy. Laws which make somebody like me saying what I'm saying now to you a criminal offense for which I could just be jailed. Even sort of thinking an anti-government thought has become illegal. And we're talking about, you know, as you said, 75,000 to 100,000 security personnel going to war against people who since independence, which was more than 60 years ago, have no schools, no hospitals, no running water, nothing. And now they're being killed, or imprisoned, or just criminalized. You know, it's like, if you're not in the Salva Judum camp, then you're a Maoist and we can kill you. And they are openly celebrating the Sri Lanka solution to terrorism.
Arundhati Roy, can you explain a little bit more about how India has so successfully hidden this side of it, this underbelly of democracy that you bring out in your book? Murder, disappearances, torture, rapes, thousands, millions of people displaced, whether it's for development projects or in the process of fighting wars. Tens of thousands disappeared in Kashmir. The insurgency that's being fought, the military that's fighting the insurgency in the Northeast. How is India on a global stage continues to be seen as the successful democracy, a place where investors are flooding to?
Well, precisely because it is a democracy for some of its citizens, you know. And so in a way, it has, this whole system has somehow created an elite that is now suddenly enriched in the last, 20 years since the advent of the corporate free market. We have a huge middle class that is hugely invested in this sort of police, or a police state that isn't acknowledged as one. So you have, it's not just a small sort of coterie of generals like in Burma, or a kind of military dictatorship that's supported by the US in America. You have a huge constituency in this country that completely supports this whole enterprise. And you have a free media where 90% of the turnover of those media houses comes from corporate advertisements and so on. So they are also free, but free to also embrace this particular model in which a small section of people, well, not a small section, there are millions and millions of people, but they are not the majority of the people of this country. The light shines upon this rising middle class, which is, as I said, such a huge number that it's a very, very attractive market for the whole world. So when India opens its markets, because it has opened its markets and because it's, international finance is flooding in and all of that is so attractive, it is allowed to commit genocide in Gujarat. It's allowed to commit civil war in the center. It's allowed to have a military occupation in Kashmir where you have 700,000 soldiers, patrolling that little valley. It's allowed to have laws like the Armed Forces Special Powers Act in the Northeast, which allows the army to just kill on suspicion. And yet it's celebrated. It's allowed to displace millions of people. But yet it's celebrated as this real success story because it has all these institutions in place, even though they've been hollowed out. So you have, for example, a Supreme Court in which there are very erudite judges, and there are some very erudite judgments. But if you look at how it's actually functioning, it has hollowed out. To criticize the court is a criminal offense. And yet you have judgments where a judge openly says something like, I've forgotten the exact words, but how corporate, a corporate company cannot basically commit anything illegal, cannot commit an illegal act, or you have a judge in court openly talking about, let's say, Vedanta, which is mining in Orissa for bauxite, and the Norwegian government had pulled out of that project because of the human rights violations and so on, and for a whole lot of ethical reasons they pulled out. And in India, the company was taken to court, and a judge openly, in an open court, says that, okay, we won't give this contract to Vedanta, we'll give it to Sterlite, because Sterlite's a very good company, I have shares in it. Omitting to mention that Sterlite is a subsidiary of Vedanta. But there's so much fancy footwork. If it was a military dictator, they would have just said, shut up, and Vedanta will get the project. But here there are affidavits and counter affidavits and a little bit of delay and everything. Everyone thinks it's democracy. You have, you have the Supreme Court hearing on, let's say, the Parliament attack, where openly the Supreme Court of the world's greatest democracy says, on the one hand, we don't have evidence to prove that the person who is charged belongs to a terrorist group. And a few paras later it says, but the collective conscience of society will only be satisfied if we sentence him to death. And it's just said so blatantly out there, and you can't criticize it because it's a criminal offense.
Arundhati Roy, talk about Kashmir. I think it's something, certainly here in the United States, a conflict people understand very little.
Well, Kashmir was a independent sort of kingdom in 1947 at the time of independence and partition. And when, I mean, just to cut a very complicated story short, when partition happened, both India and Pakistan fought over it and hived off parts of it, and both now have military presence in this divided Kashmir. But to give you some idea of the military presence, it's, you know, let's say the US has 165,000 troops in Iraq. India has 700,000 troops in Kashmir.